So I kind of framed it off to start a bit, and you can see it in that title from your piece. Canada's aspiring populists actually aren't all that radical. Maybe we'll just kind of start there. Where were you looking to go with that?
Yeah, well, it was interesting to see some of the responses to the piece. I was kind of trying to make a broad kind of overarching point that we certainly have people in this country that you could describe as populists. And I don't use the word. I think some people use it as a pejorative, as an insult. Some people use it as a praise. Honestly, I'm just trying to use it as kind of a descriptive word, right? I think certain people have that kind of populist streak, others don't. So the kind of broader point I was trying to make in the piece was that we do have these kind of populistic kind of figures, right? The Pierre Poilievre is obviously kind of the biggest name on the radar right now for a variety of reasons. But the bigger point I was trying to make was that these populists they might be populist, but they're not actually that radical in kind of some grand significant way. They're not trying to kind of like radically overturn kind of Canada's existing constitutional order. And then the more kind of maybe abstract point I was trying to make is that even our populists are kind of they're broadly speaking kind of liberals in the real grand sense of the term, right? They're small L liberals and that they're committed to things like freedom and equality. They have different understandings of what that means from, say, kind of progressive or mainstream liberals do. But in some sense, there's differences there, but they're not quite as radical as our kind of certain kind of I won't name names, but certain kind of legacy media, mainstream media voices want to suggest, right, that we have these real radical, dangerous populists in the midst. And I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, well, and I mean, populism can be applied to a lot of movements or politicians historically that have risen and taken a public sentiment and perhaps inspired it a bit and brought it about and led to often big change. Sometimes it's been horrible. I mean, people could arguably say that the rise of Hitler was a populist movement in its time. But as you rightly pointed out in your column, so was the NDP. When they began, I mean, they were prairie populists coming from the left. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It depends on what the individual who is a populist plans to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the NDP, right? The current Conservative Party, the CPC, also has roots in a kind of populist movement, right? The Reform Party, I think, it was fair to, I don't think, again, not an insult, I think it was fair to describe Reform as a kind of Western populist movement. And it's also interesting as well that Canada does have a long history of populist movements, right? I think it's fair to do like Reform, CCF, what becomes the NDP, I think are populist movements. I think even, going back a bit further, things like social credit were probably in some sense kind of populist movement. So if anything, the fact that we're seeing a bit of a bubbling of populism, especially in Western Canada again, if anything, that's not some aberration. That's in many ways kind of a return to the norm, right? The things that kind of really have driven Canadian politics for the last century and a half nearly. So yeah, in that sense, again, it's really nothing that radical. It's not that new.
No, and I mean we've had. Looking to Alberta, an example, you look a little young to perhaps remember, but with Ralph Klein, sort of, with an internal party rejuvenation movement almost. I mean, the Progressive Conservatives had been in power in Alberta for decades, but they've been getting stale. And he sort of roused up a populist sentiment within the province and rejuvenated his own party through that. And again, though, his changes really weren't all that terribly radical, though some would dispute that. He wasn't looking to tear down the system. He was just looking to get things back in order, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and again, I don't think it's one of my favorite kind of it's a bit, like you said, it's a bit before my time, but the kind of Great Reform, like the West wants in, right? Like that was a populist movement, but they were I think Reform was seeking in some sense kind of certain kind of significant changes back in the day. I mean, the most obvious kind of like institutional one was the changes to the Senate, the elected Senate, having an elected Senate. So that is in some sense a populist movement, right? It's an attempt to, and that is a kind of, I think it's probably fair to call something like that radical, and that it is attempting to change something. But again, radical doesn't necessarily mean good or bad, right? There could be bad radical changes, there could be good radical changes. And when we look at the kind of crop of populists we have today, and again, Poilievre is just kind of the creme de la creme of them right now, just given his kind of the kind of prominence he's got. Poilievre's tweaking at the edges on certain things. I think maybe some of the stuff he said about the Bank of Canada is probably his most kind of, it's called like institutionally challenging stuff. But again, if you go and you don't have to actually. This was a point I tried to make in the piece. You don't have to agree with what Poilievre is saying per se about the bank. Maybe you think he's completely wrong, but if you actually go and look at what he's saying about the bank, he's not suggesting that he wants to kind of, destroy the Bank of Canada in the way that if you go and listen to some of the kind of like anti-neoliberal left-wing populists in places like Europe, they're quite often, these people will be quite anti-central banks, but what they're anti is very much the idea of kind of, that like money and the supply of money should essentially belong to the people. That's not what Poilievre is offering, right? He's basically saying that he's arguing that the Bank of Canada's independence has been undermined by the mass spending and kind of essentially propping up a government agenda for 2 years. And what he wants to do is to essentially restore the independence. So again, you agree or disagree with Poilievre. I'll leave that up to the listener to decide. But what he's saying there is still not he's not actually radically trying to, change the Bank of Canada. He thinks he's restoring it to what it historically should be, right? Which is an independent central bank that's job is to control inflation.
Well, that's it. And people dismiss him sometimes. And as you said, almost pejoratively, he's a populist, as if it's a bad thing in and of itself, when realistically we should be looking at the individual policies within it. I mean, if there's some that you think are too radical or too wrong, then bring out the policies. But to try and dismiss an entire campaign with that word, I think is a misappropriation of the word. And it's not allowing for a better conversation on what's going on.
Yeah. And again, I think a problem with so much Canadian discourse and politics kind of discussions more broadly is that we really do. I think we get lazy sometimes and we just look for analogy, like to make kind of lazy comparisons elsewhere, right? So I think about the people that Poilievre's been compared to, right? It's just every kind of populist under the sun, right? I've seen him compared to Trump, obviously, to Johnson in the UK, to Marine Le Pen in France, which I think is kind of a really kind of silly comparison. But again, if populism is a kind of Canadian, it's an old Canadian tradition, right? I actually think it's much more interesting to compare Poilievre to the older, maybe something like Preston Manning, right? Were there any similarities there? And I think, and you're right. I don't think I wish people would use populist as kind of just a kind of descriptive label, right? I really think populism, I think might be described as kind of temperamental, right? There's a kind of populists certainly have a kind of tempestuousness about them. I wouldn't always call it anger, but they're tapping into something, right? Like real frustrations and grievances. So in that sense, I think there's that's a kind of people again will use that as an insult, as a pejorative. I just think it's just so people put their cards on the table when they do that. And again, so when these people will frame Poilievre as this kind of terrifying populist is going to destroy the Canada we know and love, something along those lines. And I don't even mean this. It's funny. I got some of the responses to the article thought I was defending Poilievre. Some of them thought I was attacking Poilievre. I was honestly not trying to do either of those things. I was just trying to make the observation that, like, look, he might have this. Might be fair to describe him as a populist, but it really is everything he's offering right now is fairly kind of milquetoast, certainly within the kind of narrow boundaries of what's acceptable in Canadian discourse. Right? He really isn't challenging any of the kind of real, the various many third rails or taboos of Canadian politics. I don't think it's hard to say that Poilievre is really challenging anything like that, or that any of the kind of for the most part, any of the populist movements we have in this country right now, there's people here and there that certainly challenge kind of, these third rails, but there's certainly no major kind of figures or movement, I think, that really do, right? So, I think so much of this discourse is so sloppy and so lazy, and that we think more carefully about these terms, and we actually try and have kind of serious discussions and analyses of what we're talking about here. It really kind of changes what you're maybe it doesn't change your view of someone like Poilievre, but it certainly might temper your fears or your expectations, right?
Yeah, well, and if there's any hallmark, I guess you could say, of a malignant populism, when a leader or a figure is trying to incite or get the people up against, they like to take advantage of xenophobia, and immigration or foreigners is often a tempting target for them. And you kind of go into that as well, at least whatever may be going on with Poilievre. Immigration hasn't been an area where he's been radical or trying to stir up any sort of negative movements of any sort.
No, exactly. And to be, I should say, as a first generation immigrant myself, I am, I'm quite pleased with that, right? So I'm not opposed to immigration. I think that we can certainly have debates about, the number of immigrants we have, but it's amazing that even we had a record number of immigrants to Canada last year. It was about 400,000. And again, we don't need to necessarily have an argument about specific numbers, right? But the idea that is kind of beyond the pale of public discourse, I've always thought is kind of very strange, right? Like, these are certainly questions people should be able to ask and not be kind of terrified of, what they'll be accused of being. if they bring it up. But yeah, that was I tried to make that point in the piece that Poilievre's not challenging that, right? If anything, he's trying to appeal to immigrant communities, which again I don't think is a bad thing, right? I think that's probably a good thing, especially if he wants to win an election. But again, he's being some of the people he's been compared to, right? Like people like Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen. Like the idea that what Poilievre is saying there would be kind of acceptable to the most hardcore, most devoted supporters of someone like Trump, for example. It's just kind of silly, right? Like these are different people, and we should stop engaging with. We should stop using these kind of lazy comparisons. One other kind of the piece in question was fairly long. I won't say it was short. There was actually a separate section that got cut just for space constraints. And one of the other kind of immigration is obviously one of the third rails of Canadian politics. The other, and I think it's going to be we're going to be having discussions about this in the very near future again, is abortion, right? Again, it's just kind of I tend to be a descriptive observation. Lewis, I think, is going to be a guest later, right? Leslyn Lewis is kind of the social conservative in the conservative leadership race right now. She's the pro-life option. But again, if you actually go and look at what she's proposing and what she's campaigning on, it's fairly modest stuff in terms of what so there's a ban on sex selective abortions. There's, I think, a ban on like overseas funding for abortions. But even Leslyn Lewis, the social conservative, the pro-life MP in the race, she would never even think to propose something like. It amazes me when I talk to Canadians and they think that we have kind of when you tell them about like European style how abortion is generally regulated in Europe versus America. Most European countries, I think the abortion limit is around 12 weeks. It varies a little bit, but that's fairly early on, right? In a pregnancy, it's basically at the end of the first trimester. But Leslyn Lewis, our radical, scary social, the one that's going to put us back to theocracy. If you listen to certain people, she's not proposing, like a French style or European style abortion limits. What she's proposing are pretty small, not unambitious and modest restrictions by comparison. So on all sorts of these topics, right, these third rail topics, these taboos, we really don't have like true radical challenges to them. Again, there might be voices here and there, but there certainly isn't like kind of mainstream organized movement that challenges these things. We have this fairly narrow, and I would suggest, for better or for worse, I'd say for worse on many things, this very narrow and very stable consensus on all sorts of topics.
Yeah, and as you said, and I'm glad you brought it up. Ms. Lewis's position on abortion actually is really where a lot of American Democrats would land. I mean, she would be considered pretty moderate compared to some of the more activist Republicans amongst the bunch. But to even broach the issue immediately starts getting that pushback. And I mean, is that a bit of a cultural thing within Canada too? Although, I mean, are we afraid of substantial change? Like, is that why populism as a pejorative is as effective as it can be sometimes when it's used against people? Because we don't embrace any large radical changes, or at least we haven't traditionally. We talk big, but as you said, even when these people get into power who did it on a populist wave, they don't tend to really change a whole heck of a lot structurally or substantially once they get there.
Yeah, that's my kind of. I think this is true not just in Canada but in other places. I think Canada is generally a more maybe kind of temperamentally modest, right, place. I don't think Canadians, I think, are much less quick to kind of anger and rage maybe than other places. And I think sometimes that's good, and I think sometimes that's bad, right? I think sometimes we should get angry about things that we kind of just let government get away with. I think it's even there's obviously kind of structural reasons, right, why sometimes changes are just hard to make, right? There's a kind of status quo that is a status quo for a reason, right? It's entrenched. And there's in the desire to, it takes real, if there's some sort of major reform you want to embark on, it's going to take real significant kind of desire and will and kind of motivation to do it. So in many ways, kind of just a kind of benign status quo prevails, not so much because it's popular, but just because kind of the effort to undo it or change it would take a lot of work in the other way. We could go through issue by issue, right? There's all sorts of things that there are things in Canada that I would like to see changed. It doesn't mean that's going to happen, right? It's just kind of unfortunate or fortunate, depending on your perspective, and unfortunate reality about how this country works. I think one kind of major problem we have in Canada is we do have, and this was again kind of a broader kind of point about this piece is we do have a very narrow kind of, I don't want to get too technical, but people sometimes call the Overton window, right? We really do have a kind of narrow window of what is generally considered acceptable opinions. So plenty of people might hold opinions that are actually kind of, outside that fairly narrow window, but especially in kind of media and kind of discourse, that window is so narrow that people that hold those perspectives might either not express them at all, or just kind of very subtly kind of hint at it here and there, but be kind of worried about kind of the consequences of saying so. I mean, if regardless of whether maybe even if someone generally likes kind of the status quo in Canada today, I would suggest we'd actually benefit from having a kind of wider discourse where there's just a wider range of kind of permitted, acceptable opinion, precisely so that we can actually have more kind of serious engagements and debates over kind of major issues and major topics. I don't think Canada's well served at all by having kind of a very narrow, kind of very thin consensus, because it really just allows a lot of kind of complacency and shallow and sloppy thinking, right? So again, even if you generally like kind of, broadly speaking, the kind of consensus in Canada, I think we benefit from a more open culture where we can actually have debates about things that maybe, people don't want to have debates about right now for various reasons.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. We have an opportunity right now with a leadership race where hopefully you get a number of people to talk about some of the individual issues. And if we keep playing I like your use of the term, it's just being lazy by dismissing this as populism here or there and not having the conversation. It doesn't mean you have to like or dislike whatever a candidate's saying, but we need to open up that discourse rather than keep being so polarized and shutting it down with simplistic terms, I guess you could say. So I appreciate you coming on to expand a bit on that. And where could we find more information on what you're writing and what you're doing? That piece that caught my eye was in the Hub. You're active elsewhere as well?
Yeah, I generally write for the Hub these days. So the Hub is where you'll see my writing fairly frequently. I'm in the National Post fairly frequently. And if you want to just keep track of what I'm doing, I have a Twitter account you can follow. That's just my name, @Ben_Woodfinden. And I have a newsletter as well, a Substack that I do. I've kind of, it's not super active, but it's, it's all public stuff. So if people want to go back and read some kind of older things I've written, they're welcome to check that out. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you again for taking some time to talk to us today. And I look forward to reading more of your pieces. Perhaps we'll talk again down the road.
Cheers. Yeah, would love to be on again. Thank you.